studying Caribbean literature. And Caribbean literature, when it comes to the concept of word literature, is very important and very peculiar for a very good reason. Caribbean literature, the Caribbean itself, the nature of the Caribbean is different to the African, is different to the Australian, is different to the Indo-Pakistani, which are areas I'm also interested in, particularly because the Caribbean itself is a multicultural society. It's one of the very oldest multicultural societies because they come from China, they come from India, and many different parts of the world. And then I thought of the concept of displacement and the translation of the concept of displacement, and I expanded. That's how the book started. I expanded on the concept semantically. So the concept is, when translated to Arabic, is translated to nuzuh, and the word nuzuh to evacuate, to displace, and that particular concept is exclusive. Well, I tried to make it a bit exclusive to the national experience of Palestine. And therefore, it's different to the concept of exile. So it becomes kind of an umbrella concept to other concepts such as expatriation, immigration with an I, immigration with an E. What else? Can we think of other concepts? Immigration, expatriation, exile, diaspora, for example. Right? What's that? Expulsion. The concept of exile basically has always had a connotation that is very negative, right? So Victor Hugo said it's a punishment, it's particular and exclusive to the bourgeois, for example, and that's where, for example, Salman Rushdie differs from using the concept with Edward Said. Edward Said says, you know, the Palestinian experience is discontinuous, it's incoherent, you can't put it in one narrative, therefore you can't call it diaspora. Diaspora is, you know, bound by redemption, what we call in cultural studies redemption. Redemption is basically the physical return of the masses, and it's very exclusive to a certain ethnicity. Whereas the exile, the concept of exile is comprehensive of this Palestinian experience that is very incoherent, very discontinuous. And there is a chapter in the book where I talk about the differences between the Palestinian experience and the Jewish diaspora, as well as different types of diaspora. And I argue that the Palestinian experience becomes transnational, so it develops and grows through and despite differences, and it adapts what in French philosophy is called re-territorialization. So you are deterritorialized, displaced from a certain territory, space, place, and then you reroute it. The title of the book originally was Rerouting Displacement. Rerouting, R-E-R-O-U-T, not double O. So you kind of take a different turn every time you're displaced. And this brings me to the equation of past and present, where, you know, when you're displaced, there's this equation of past and present. You're always nostalgic. When you're nostalgic, you remember, and you risk being ghettoized in this kind of closed boundary that is the past. And here I bring in a very interesting theory of called the cultural turn. So basically, Stuart Hall, he's a Jamaican British theorist, and he's the first to establish an Afro-British institution of cultural studies in England, in Europe for that reason, and he put together this theory of a cultural turn. Turn in Arabic, this is really interesting when you translate it. It's not iltifaf, so you don't actually ditch the past. It's translated into in'itaf. So you take that experience of the past and translate it. So I also adopt that conception of cultural translation. And failure to achieve cultural translation when you're displaced between two spaces, between two entities of an identity, that's when I introduce the concept of what we call cultural ghettoization or mental ghettoization. And a very sort of peculiar characteristic of the ghetto is that you don't know what's going on beyond the ghetto. So you were kind of closed in. And here's where I would like to bring in my theoretical framework of the concept of displacement. So semantically, as I said, I expanded to become a bit exclusively Palestinian to the historical experience. But the theoretical framework, basically, in the late 1960s, Deleuze and Guattari are two French philosophers, and they put together a book titled Anti-Oedipus and Schizophrenia. It's a very interesting book. And they came up and coined a concept they called nomadology. So basically, nomadology assumes that we are all nomads in the desert. And this is very dangerous. It angered me. I still remember the time I read it for the first time. It angered me because the desert in cultural studies and in literature is dangerous as a metaphor because there are no points of reference. So you don't know where you started, basically, right? You know where you're going, but you don't know where to go what to go back to. So they deleted this concept of origins. They deleted this concept of beginnings, right? And nomadology is a very free-floating, ontologically rootless, aloof concept. And they came up with what they call the nomadic rhythm. So basically, a rhythm is a very botanic concept. So do we know what a rhythm plant is? So for a Palestinian reference of a plant is usually the olive tree, right? Or the fig tree, because it plows its roots downwards. So we kind of, I see this around Ramallah, we're trees, right? And they say, no, we're not trees, we're rhythms, right? A rhythm is basically, don't think of olive trees, think of strawberries, think of onions, think of water lilies. The root does not plow in, it plows out. So therefore, what matters is what comes out on the surface, and therefore we're not basically rooted. And I kind of like that concept, that we're not trees, because in a time of a storm, if you're rooted too much, you risk breaking, right? Whereas if you sway, if you become a bit more flexible, you go with the flow a bit, right? But their concept is too aloof, right? So we don't have beginnings, we don't have origins. I like the open endedness of that concept, but not really the fact that we don't come from somewhere. Every single piece of literature, basically this book, combines two groups of displaced writers. So I started looking, if we want to time frame the book, basically it starts in 1945, the end of the Second World War, and therefore the masses of immigration, independence, decolonization, etc. 1945 and 2003. And I divide the writers, the displaced writers, into two groups. The first group basically spans over 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then the second group, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and onward, right? First generation, second and third generations, two separate categories. As I said, when I started researching on the concept of displacement, there were probably two books, one on cinema and displacement, and the other was a group of essays, and the framework of those essays were two novels. So I basically wrote the book I wanted to read at the time, right? So I kept compiling it and working on it to become what it has become today. The first group consists mainly and primarily of a Nigerian, a Sudanese, and 4 other Caribbean writers. The second group is really more interesting, to me at least. They're different in their own ways. The first group characteristics of the first group of such displaced writers, they were always bemoaning, displacement, looking at it as something negative, very nostalgic, overly nostalgic, excessively attached to the past, always keeping the question of return alive, which was dangerous in their writings, and also very nationalistic. So they still had that kind of nationalistic idea of what home is. The second group, on the other hand, was more adventurous. So they came up with new literary techniques, magic realism, with Salman Rushdie. The diversity of the races also amplified, so we don't have exclusively a group of Caribbean writers and Caribbean writers mainly, but we also have Chinese, we have Japanese. Kazuo Ishiguro recently won the Nobel Prize in 2017. I recommend, if you haven't read Ishiguro, I recommend The Remains of the Day, such a really interesting book. And very adventurous in their themes. So the first generation always talked about racism, racial and accommodation, and the return. The second generation thought the return is a myth, right? We can't consider any possibility of a return. It's a myth because it's time traveling. Because when you leave a place, it's not the place that changes only, but yourself. And that's why I think at some point I'll talk about why we cry at airports, because you realize that the self you leave behind, whether it is you, your parents, etc., is no longer existent. That's not going to come back. That's in the past. And that can be very problematic. But they move away from that and they kind of take it playfully, and they realize, you know, I'm a different person now, this is a different space, and they start talking about class instead of racism. They started talking about sexuality. So the conception, the subject matter changes totally. What this taught me is the fact that identity is not a fixed concept, is not a fixed unit. Identity is fluid, always becoming, flexible. And it was also evident because the first generation I read were always asking the question, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? With no answers, right? Because there was like this invisible wall. They struggled to assimilate. If at all, it was assimilation, right? And the second group of displaced writers, they were successful at integration, right? There's a very massive difference between the two. Assimilation is when you leave massive chunks of your natal identity and you're not able to translate that culturally or linguistically or racially or even psychologically into a new identity, right? An extension, a natural extension of that identity. Integration is more successful and optimistic, where you don't leave massive chunks. You don't have to cancel any part of your natal identity, because we have two different identities, right? We have the natal and we have the cultural. We have the filiative and the affiliative, right? The filiative is what you're born with, right? The affiliative is what you give birth to. And also the natal is very biological. It's very philological, whereas the affiliative is very cultural. It's very philosophical, if you wish. And therefore, there's a really interesting concept Edward Said uses from music, because he played the piano. And it is basically, the concept is contrapuntal. So contrapuntal is when you need two notes of music to make a symphony. And he was into symphonies, and going back to word literature, basically, Goethe, when he coined the concept of word literature, he was influenced by the West Eastern Diwan by Hafiz, and Edward Said and Daniel Bernboim, who is a Jewish Austrian musician, they put together an orchestra, and they called it the WEDA, or the West Eastern Diwan Orchestra. And it's played in Gaza a few years ago, and it was the first European. And this kind of concept, when it's applied to that orchestra, it encompasses different members of Israelis, Palestinians, and Europeans around the world. So the third and fourth chapters of the book, they are divided into these two groups of displaced writers. The first one, which is primarily Caribbean, is called the Windrush Generation, and simply it's given this. I mean, it's a given entity, and it's an already established group in cultural studies and post-colonial literature, and simply because they traveled in a ship called the Windrush Generation. So they call them the Windrush Generation. Actually, a few months ago, Theresa May called for this particular group to go back to the Caribbean, and the Labour Party saw it as a very, racial, discriminatory behavioral attitude. The second group, I ventured to give it my own adventurous title, and I call it the Masala Fish Generation. Basically, I believe that. So I basically take the concept of displacement and break it down to different categories. So first we talked about the semantic expansion of it, but I also, in the first chapter, I talk about how I expanded into geographical displacement, which is something first generation writers went through. Second generation writers did not necessarily go over that or through that, simply because they were second generation, or because they were conscious of the time they traveled, or they were born in the host country. And the second one is cultural displacement. Cultural displacement is basically manifest in literature through or different kinds of narratives, because I don't only study fiction, but I also study memoirs and autobiographies, etc. Manifest in costumes, climate change, but also language. Language is very important when it comes to cultural displacement. Linguistic displacement is very important. And that takes me to the metaphor. I like using this metaphor when I talk about displaced writers. Displaced writers, or individuals, you can apply that on everybody else, is an amphibian. So inside and as well as an outsider. And that takes me to the politics, talking about the politics of displacement. There are poetics, and there are problematics when it comes to displacement. The poetics are basically when you have that double vision, because usually you are aware of more than one geography, and therefore you're simultaneously a part of the center and the periphery, or the margin. The first generation, for example, they were writing or rewriting the center, or writing back to the center. The second generation were writing from within the center, which is a massive difference, and I talk about here at length. Cultural displacement, as well as being linguistic, there is also food. So food is a very important cultural signifier, and it is very apparent when it comes to second generation displaced writers. They use food as a cultural marker and a signifier. So masala basically, and this particular generation encompasses both. So masala is colorful and is hot, and it's oriental, it's exotic, and it's exported. And fish is basically white, cold, and it's very British, and if you put them together it becomes this adventurous, and they draw on these, and it's very sarcastic, by the way. The first generation writing or narrative is usually very cynical. The second generation writer is very sarcastic and funny. So they talk about, for example, the English tea time. Right? If we know anything about the British, it's their English tea time. And if you think about tea time, it has nothing to do with England, right? The tea is from Sierra Leone, and the sugar is from the Caribbean, and the habit itself they kind of stole from their 250 years in India. So there is nothing. The biscuits are very. By the way, 90% of the biscuit are Scottish. So yeah. So also the Chinese bring in this cultural signifier of food. Salman Rushdie brings in that, and I use it, and I talk about that in the fourth chapter of the book. Some people ask about the title of the book. As I said, the title at the beginning was Rerouting, because nomadology adapts deterritorialization. Deterritorialization basically is the fact that there is no territory to go back to. There is nothing to fall back to. So there is no origin, there is no beginning. And here I should differentiate maybe between origins and beginnings. So origins is the physical entity, and usually it's associated with the whereabouts of your birth, whereas beginnings is that moment you start articulating meaning, right? It's the moment you start articulating meaning. So to me, I see identity and home as this kind of amalgamation of cultural experiences. Moments. We belong to moments. We don't belong to geography. This is how I see it, at least. And also to go back to the concept of a cultural turn, which belongs to Stuart Hall. A cultural turn basically moves between these different points of references, which nomadology adapts or adopts, but the concept itself is too open, and I adapt that in my... Please come in. I adapt that in the concept of displacement. But I also try to draw on the specificity of identity. That we have a beginning, we have an origin. Identity starts from where? There is always a starting point. Yeah, it's okay. As opposed to the concept of nomadology, which is too open, which is fine, but it deletes that kind of starting point. There is also the psychoanalytic conception of the audible territoriality. Basically, an audible territory is a concept Freud came up with. So basically he said the Oedipus complex, or the audible territory, is the family, and all that is wrong with our anxiety and concern comes from that unit or boundary we call family, right? Because that's the first home that you learn everything from, right? And that is a very closed, very centered, very fixed entity, as opposed to nomadology that is open and free. And then he says, or the philosophers that came after, particularly those French philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari, who put together the concept of nomadology, they said, if you take that very boundary of the family and apply it to other boundaries, such as school, or even the pub or the bar, or even bigger than that, society, or even bigger than that, the nation, right? That also becomes very problematic. But they reverse it. They say he is wrong in his interpretation of psychoanalysis, because he thought that the unconscious is what causes the problem to the conscious. So you're lying on the sofa and speaking becomes the problem, not the cure. They said, no, you go out throughout the day and things are absorbed by the conscious, and they are reversed into your unconscious, and therefore you sleep, you dream about them, so the symbols in your dreams become, and that I take and apply on post-colonial literature as psychological displacement. But I also keep going back and forth between these two concepts, which are very dangerous: nomadology or nomadology and the audible territory, because the audible territory is very closed. It's very fixed, it's very centered. Nomadology is too open and I try to fluctuate at ease between the two using these three major concepts. A cultural turn, which is born out of Caribbean literature and cultural studies, and mental and cultural ghettoization, which is put by Indo-Pakistani cultural studies. Salman Rushdie started with that. And cultural translation. Identity is always dangerous when it is centered around something. Let it be sexuality, national, religious, whatever it is. And that's why I like the concept of displacement, because it disrupts. It shakes the boundaries. It strips the veil of race, nation, religion, sexuality, everything else. And you become, when displaced, you become very self-conscious for the first time of your own identity. And that's when it hits. And that's why I try to think playfully of the concept of displacement. First generation, it has always been a modern, for modernist writers, it's always been problematic. Because up to the 1960s, I can say, 1970s, the question has been, who am I? Who am I? But postmodern writers and post-colonial writers started asking the question, what else could I become? So the question stopped being about this being, it started becoming, or yeah, it started becoming about becoming. It started being centered around becoming. In the conclusion, I'm just trying to summarize and brief the contents of the book here. In the conclusion, I talk about the clash of civilizations. The Clash of Civilizations is basically a paper put together in the 1960s and, and a concept that became known to both the East and the West. And it's deconstructed by the major theorists of post-colonial studies, Edward Said, Spivak, Homi Babaha, and the likes. It started with the fact that you're culturally marginalized because of your culture, but later on it became the fact that you're marginalized basically because of your race. So the concept is no longer cultural, it became biological, right? Because of your blood, you're therefore, we're morally obligated or obliged to kind of bring you civilization. And I reflect on, in 2011, I think it was David Cameron who came out and said, we can no longer accept bad immigration. So he basically categorized immigration into bad and good. And this shows naivety towards understanding what an amazing cultural, multicultural society was forming in London at the time. But then Angela Merkel came out and she was like, multiculti has failed, right? Multiculturalism failed in Germany, and she felt guilty later on, and she took the Syrian refugees in. And then the French Prime Minister came out, and he was like, we cannot accept the burqa, and therefore it was this kind of, Europe was kind of ganging again towards the end of 2011, and therefore I go into comparing between the melting pot that is exemplary of the US as well as the multicultural society that is in London. Writing Displacement, to go back to the title, I keep digressing, right? So basically these are two of my favorite words in English, right? Writing and displacement. But I also, a student yesterday in An-Najah University said there's an is missing, so writing is displacement, and I totally agree, because post-colonial literature is basically, 90% of it is autobiographical. Up to the 1980s, I don't think there are any memoir written by post-colonial writers, simply because all of the material of their own life and personal life was used in their novels, right? So writing and displacement both have, as a mutual aspect between them, the fact that they both need and demand constant editing. So identity is similar to displacement and writing in the sense that they both demand constant editing. Identity cannot be final. Identity is always in the state of becoming. I'll stop here. Maybe if you have any questions, I can open the floor to some questions, and then we can take it from there. Hello. Hi. Okay. You don't have to move place to be displaced, by the way. This is very important to understand. Today, or in postmodern times, a user of the internet is displaced, right? you're displaced behind the screen of your computer, right? You can live all your life in Ramallah, never see any other place, and yet be existentially, anguished. So geographical displacement is not essential when it comes to displacement. The disruption can be psychological, from within, just that moment of realization that I don't belong. So loss causes your recognition of belonging in a way. Multiplicity, I promote in the book for multiplicity over singularity. Because I have a problem, for example, with the adjective half-caste. If you're Afro-American, you're half-caste. If you're a hyphenated individual, like what I talk about in the book, hyphenated writers, hyphenated identities, it's not half-caste. If anything, you're double-caste. So again, I try to internationalize the Palestinian narrative by finding intersecting references or points of reference with the Caribbean, with the Indo-Pakistani, with the African, to show that we're not talking about one history. We're talking about in terms of a plurality of histories, and therefore our identities should actually look at it that way. I like one particular book, for example, by Carl Phillips. Carl Phillips wrote this book titled A New World Order, and he basically divided the book into 4 chapters. He was born in England but then worked in the US, but he is an Afro-Caribbean, so he writes about Africa, America, he writes about England, he writes about India, and he says, I want to be buried in that, like in the middle of that triangle. I don't want to be buried in one particular. And it's very metaphoric, because every time he starts a chapter of the book, he says, I am here but I don't belong. I belong but I don't return, which echoes Mahmoud Darwish, for example. Mahmoud Darwish says, I am here, I am back but I have not returned. I am here but I'm not home, something like that. So I definitely think in terms of multiplicity, comparison, binary oppositions. It started in 1904 with this Afro-American writer Dubois, and he's the first to obtain a PhD as a black American, and he's the first to obtain a PhD, or write a book in sociology, and he called it two-ness, as in two-ness, as in two identities. And then we have concepts like hybridity, syncretism, contrapuntal. Now some people has adopted that particular concept. So yeah, definitely I think, because again, you see outside of the box when you're outside. A student yesterday actually surprised me. She was like, if I'm a 3rd generation Palestinian writer, how authentic or how can I be representative of the Palestinian experience? And I told her my personal story, and that adds to the book. My parents come from a very small village in Palestine, Kafr al-Deek, near Salfit, and I was born in Jordan, and then I was hijacked to Germany for like a few years, and then I left to England, and I write exclusively in English. So I have to, every time there comes this question, when I move outside of the Arab world, where are you from? And I have to tell the whole story. I am Palestinian by descent, I am Jordanian by birth, I am German by nationality, and I write in English. And this is what we call disrupted currents, right? So I see displacement as a series of disrupted currents. It's not one, it's the and the but, and the and the but, and yeah. Yes. Mm.
It's disruptions in thinking, and it's a struggle internally, constantly, because one of the things that we Palestinians have always been taught was maintain your identity.
Mm.
But the question becomes,
Yes.
And how much of that is actually maintaining that identity but adding to it, and how much of it is actually you're losing that identity, and maintaining that balance becomes extremely difficult.
It's very challenging.
Just simple examples, the conservatism of Palestinian society, and having a daughter or a son born in the US.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that when your daughter comes home and she says, "Daddy, meet my boyfriend"? You know, I mean, how do
Yeah.
you deal with it?
Yeah.
And how much do you want to maintain
Yeah.
that conservatism and that identity, and how much do you want to allow it to blend because the world is becoming a different place?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. Third Generation, I end the book with this amazing novel, Brick Lane, if you haven't read it. Brick Lane is by Monica Ali, and Monica Ali was born in Bangladesh and taken to London at the age of 3. And she writes one of the very first post-colonial pieces of literature after the 11th of September. And it's very important that we focus on literature, the shift of paradigm after the 11th of September, simply because the paradigm of identity shifted from the national to the religious. It became more dangerous afterwards. And she talks about that thoroughly in the book, but also she talks about how difficult it is for children to kind of choose. Because first generation had a choice. Second generation probably had more or less the same kind of choice, but children have no choice. And when it's a female character, it's even like worse and even more complex, because females are always at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? So if you're a female displaced character, you are basically marginalized by both the male, the white male, as well as the black male, and you become at the bottom of it. And you may add class and sexuality and everything else into that multi-layered entity we call identity. But also her kids, the father keeps telling them, we're gonna go back to Bangladesh, and she calls it Bangladesh. So she wants to ditch it, and she has this conversation with her sister, the 2 little daughters, in the toilet, and they're brushing the teeth, and it's very funny. And she tells her, "Do you think there are toothbrushes in Bangladesh?" And they're very funny, but they reinforce these kind of stereotypical images of what the East is seen by the West, and also the color of their skin. Most characters in post-colonial literature are called Karim because the color of their skin is like creamy, so it's not black nor white. It's cruel. We call it cruel in post-colonial studies. So it's in between. It's beige, and therefore it resembles or reflects their own identity. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. This is, I think, established in post-colonial literature when it comes to the Palestinian concept. The fact that the Palestinian is exiled both internally as well as externally, which adds to the depth But again, as I said at the beginning, the incoherence of the Palestinian experience, you have, you don't have one Palestine, you have Palestines. That's why return is more difficult. You have Palestine in 1948 and then 1967. And by the way, the people who were exiled after 1967 are called displacees. They're not called refugees. And it goes back to the concept of displacement and how I semantically make it Palestinian. 1987, 2000, the first Intifada, second Intifada, and you have a multiplicity of generations of Palestinians that you cannot encompass. Murid Barghouthi talks about that as well in I Saw Ramallah, and the fact that, you know, I feel alienated when I left, I feel alienated when I come back. So what do you do when you can't go away and you cannot come back? There is also a section in I Saw Ramallah which is a piece of world literature, simply because in I Saw Ramallah it was written in Arabic, translated by Ahdaf Suwaif, who is an Egyptian writer, and then it was published by the American University of Cairo. And the foreword was written by Edward Said. And one of these sections is titled Ghurbat, alienation. But Ahdaf Suwaif, Ightirab. And she doesn't translate it into alienation, she translates it into displacement to make it more nationally exclusive to the experience, and I find very interesting.
Where do you find like more alienation from which generation experience, the first generation experience?
Can you say that again?
Alienation, where you feel it like very, very in the literature, very intense.
First generation alienation is very intense.
September 11, I feel it getting back like to the.
Yeah, it's a circle. Yeah.
If you point outside, you become to the point zero.
100%. Yeah. And that's manifested in literature. The ending, it ends with suicide. There are also is like dreams haunting you. Psychological displacement. Yes. Any more questions?
But then they kind of go in completely different directions.
Totally.
Where does this fit into your analysis? In the sense of the going in different directions, even though they're starting from the same similar starting.
I focus more on the generational differences between first, second, and third, but it's totally different. As I said, I don't call it only displacement, I call it exilic displacement. Exilic displacement because the adjective exile or exilic adds that individuality into the experience. And displacement adds that sense of perpetual continuity or discontinuity, if you wish. So it's very individual, but also in your talking about displacement, you're always trying to kind of create this group consciousness with the rest of displaced writers or displaced individuals or displacees, if you want to call them. And I also talk about different types of diaspora, the labor diaspora, slavery diaspora, and as well as my favorite, intellectual diaspora. So the fact that writers also meet in this kind of dialogue and debate they create within post-colonial literature. I mean, we don't have an exclusive diaspora now, we call it global diaspora, because the boundary is shifting, especially in literature. Nowadays you could consider a map as a piece of literature. We no longer have anything that we call English literature. Like, what is English literature? We don't have English literature. We have literature written in English, and that's totally different. And also the word English, I particularly don't use the word English with a capital letter, because I speak English, but I also use that particular code of reference for my own experience. So it no longer becomes, and that is a big debate when it comes to linguistic displacement. How do you feel using the language of the colonizer, right? Chinua Achebe, who's the godfather of Nigerian and parts of African literature, he wrote Things Fall Apart, and he advocates for using the language of the colonized and making it yours. Whereas Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is the father of Kenyan literature, he believes that you shouldn't. You should write it in your native language and then translate it yourself if you want to reach a more of an international audience. But again, I'm one of those people who does not believe in translation. We were talking about this the other day. We say that translation is like having a shower with a raincoat on. You don't really get the sense of the effect of language. Absolutely, yeah. I'm really interested in those words I talk about in linguistic displacement. There are some words that you can't. It's very exclusive and particular to the local context. It's not universal context. So, for example, the word saudade is very exclusive to the Portuguese experience because it's one of the biggest empires in the world, despite the how small it is, Portugal. But saudade is the belonging or being nostalgic to something that you don't know what it is. And there's a sense of historical context into that because they're always nostalgic for that empire that faded away. Or it could be love, or it could be anything, but how do you translate saudade into English or into Arabic? Yeah. Any questions? Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. 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 Okay, so internal peace, I don't know about that. Like, I'm a big fan of Beckett. Samuel Beckett says, "You're on Earth, there is no cure for that." So you have to deal with it. But I do talk about passive and active immigrants. So I don't think of them in terms of bad and good. I think of them in terms of passive and active. Those who are willing to assimilate or integrate, and those who are not willing to. If you go to Germany or if you go to England, you'll come across these kind of ghettos of Indians, of Pakistanis. In Germany, the Turks. In France, the Moroccans and Algerians, and some of the behavior is intolerable. And I'm not pointing fingers, but I'm saying we should take some of the blame. But again, I talk about multiculturalism. I promote for cultural diversity, for tolerance. We need more of that in our communities. If you take Oslo, for example, the best thing that came out of Oslo was the literature that was written afterwards, because you lost the country and the last kind of spark of hope was kind of lost. But then you have these writers and scholars who came out and started talking about how important it is to grow solidarity and stick together. So yeah, the last two chapters of the book talk exactly about that. Yeah.
But there's a consistent, what do you call it? It's a consistent dichotomy between the two concepts that you talked about. The first concept being centralized in a certain piece of land or a certain area, and the other concept of being nomadic in the desert. And that fight is constantly happening, and you can see it even in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s.
Mm.
The universalization
Mm.
was taking place.
Mm.
Multicultural, for the lack of a better word, melting pot
Yeah.
was taking place.
Yeah.
And then from the mid-80s on, there was a conversion, actually, moving away from the multiculturalism. And that fight is constantly happening. It goes all the way back to history. How do you explain the cyclic nature,
Mm.
if there's an explanation
Yeah.
of this process?
Can I try to explain?
Please.
Why there is like a return back to the nationality? If that's what you're asking, in general,
But
why
it's
do you
not just nationalism. It's nationalism. It's racism. It's blending and then
Mm.
centrifuging.
I'm gonna try to tell you from my perspective.
Okay.
It's gonna be different, obviously. I think there are fundamentally things about how our brain works that scared from strangers. That's the
Okay.
scared.
Absolutely.
That's first of all. Let's stereotype one person that did bad thing and generalize it in all the people. Secondly, I think many refugees, because the people that came to European countries were less refugees from the people that came. Accepting refugees is a moral thing, but it's coming with action, and like you have in statistics, refugees are tend to be more violent because they are poor, because they came from countries and they suffer through a lot. And then it's catching a flashback, because people can be altruist until a level, and everyone has his own level. And then in some places, like you cross that level, and then people by like, yeah, I don't want him to steal my job. I don't want him to like. And also there is a lot of racism that we saw from all our society that into us. Like racism is a fundamental human being thing.
Mm.
Like
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, no. I just want to add to that. Basically, again, I'll go back to Dubois, who said in the 1900s, the problem with the world is going to be the color line, and he talked about racism. There is a whole chapter dedicated to racism in the book, and I'm not saying there is anything wrong with nationalism, but there is a very thin line between nationalism and racism, and you need to be careful with that. And that's why I promote for what I called cultural turn and cultural translation, and that's why I try to kind of move at ease between the concept of nomadology and the audible territory, with the concept of displacement, taking into consideration the Caribbean experience and the transnational experience of second and third generation Palestinian narratives. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe in your research for this book, or generally in your academia,
Mm,
Like,
that's
is it necessary to have another in order to create an identity, or can they be mutually exclusive?
from within. I think you can definitely construct an identity from within. If you look at the example of Europe and the Orientalist perspective of it, they needed black to feel white. And therefore, I don't think it's always applicable that you need a black to feel white or white to feel black. I think identity comes from within. It's a self-conscious construction. It's not an external construction or influenced externally necessarily. It comes from within.
Like, it's possible, but
It is definitely possible.
how much of identity construction today is happening
In Palestine or in general? Hmm.
I think for the current generations, the hardest question to face is like where from,
Mm.
which is the identity questions. Like you have to explain where from, which is like Jordan, Palestine, Europe,
Yeah.
because it's like it represents also the kind of conflict between the old generation and the current generation between, and it's obvious now as we see in UK for instance,
Yeah.
like the old generation is dragging back to the national Englishman identity and the
Making England great again.
the current generation is
Yeah.
calling for more European identity, not for English identity, or
Mm.
more like for skipping this kind of local identity to more wider identity.
Totally.
And it's kind of conflicting the personal life, individual life
Mm.
identity. It's like really struggling to answer this question, where are you from?
Exactly.
And it's like also like it's followed. It's racist questions, but where from? It's like where from?
Where are you
Germany?
really
Where
from?
from? You look different than German.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you see,
I want to answer some, like, my perspective.
Please.
And if it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
I think a lot of like identity based on, like most of the identity based on the difference. As the nationalism basically rose when European imperialism drove to other countries and saw what's different from them. And like that's where nationalism rise.
Yeah.
And also if you look like you explain it here in Palestine, the difference between like what defined Palestine in general just on the map, where
Yeah.
you're from.
Yeah.
It's the borders. It's what defines me from the other. If there is no borders, there is like I'm not different.
Mm.
The moment there is like borders, it's like different, and you have to these borders to compare.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. There's this one particular novel talks about that in particular by this Caribbean writer called Sam Selvin, and he says, I can't just go and say I'm a citizen of the world, and I really agree with that. You can't just go around saying I'm just, or I am the journey, not the destination, or this kind of. You can't take it. It cannot be too metaphysical, you know. At the end of the day, you come from a particular place and you belong, and you. But again, I'm saying identity becomes very dangerous when it is reliant and centered around one of those, or the authority emanates from one of those centers, and that's why I kind of like the concept of displacement, because it deconstructs that. It does not delete it. Deconstruction does not mean deletion. Deconstruction means multiplication or multiplicity of different belongings.
I'm going to tell a very short story, which I hope is indicative
Yep.
of the perception. Somebody once published a small paragraph in an American newspaper that said, the young generation is very strange. Their hair is very strange. Their clothes are completely out of whack. The way they talk is very unacceptable, and they don't respect the older generations. And the question is, who said this?
Mm.
And the answer is Socrates, which basically means, again, cycles. Everything moves in
Yeah.
in and out, in and out, in and out. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. They change, so that they move kind of like this, but they're still constantly cycles. Perceptions are the same. The older generation perceives the younger generation as strange.
Yeah.
The younger generation perceives the older generation as not being able to communicate with. So
Mm.
the whole concept, and that's why I go back to the issue of understanding where exactly is culture and where is identity, how do they combine, and how do you need to make them more fluid so that you don't constantly keep going
Back and forth between.
back and forth between multicultural conception and going back to saying, no, I'm Palestinian, I don't want to be anything but Palestinian.
Mm.
And my struggle is against the Israelis. Once I'm done with that, I'll see what I'll do. You know, I mean,
Um, I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I would say that it depends on geography. It depends on what we call an absent present. So you're born into a family with a name that you did not choose, with a face you did not choose, with a religion you did not choose, and then. But I think you become responsible when you're aware and conscious of these aspects of your own identity, and then you articulate it yourself. You either become passive or active in engaging with where the world is going. And I see the world, I don't know if you see it the same way, but I see the world going into this kind of binary and multiplicity as opposed to singularity. I do agree Britain is going back to bringing or making Britain great again. Trump is doing the same with America. But I mingle with the cultured people and the intellectual of those countries. And trust me, they all adapt the same kind of viewpoint. Nobody, and I don't know who votes for these people, but apparently somebody does. Yeah,
very large percentage.
a very large percentage.
Because they're really,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know. But that again is the downside.
I want to add something. I think I'm kind of a bit optimist about it. It's like the current generation and the old generation conflict, as we see in the US and as we see in the Britain. The old generation want to drag back the nationality identity, and the current generation want to get out of this kind of nationality cage. And
Mm.
I think this kind of identity of sense of place become more to individualism. Every person has his
Mm.
own experience of sense of place, of sense of space. For instance, European becomes like European young people, the transportation is easy for them, so they
Mm.
can travel everywhere. They can have spend years
Yeah.
in Latin America, years in Asia, years in Middle East. So the sense of identity became less and less pure, became individual thing, personal story have to explain. So I think I'm kind of optimistic.
Okay, okay.
So more individualism instead of sense of group.
Mm. But I feel that's very difficult in our part of the world where you have less individualism and more society.
It's going slowly.
Yeah, yeah.
I also want to claim that if you look at statistic of the young generation, to just like make you more sad, the young generation in like 18, 17 in United States is becoming very, very conservative.
Mm.
Like the new young generation is like one of the most, like I read some studies that claim it's very, very conservative. Like not conservative as like opposed to gay marriage, for example, but more nationalistic as like
Yeah.
like the new the generation like you have the X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
So the Y was very liberal, but the Z is becoming a bit more conservative.
I totally agree. Yeah. Again, as you said, it's a circle.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
in Europe. Here it's becoming more liberal.
Yeah. Because of immigration, you think, and because of
Immigration,
Yeah.
A lot of problems. And
Yeah.
they want to put a blame on someone, which is immigrants. It's
Yeah.
easy to put a blame on immigrants. Automation replaced a lot of human beings,
Mm.
which can be solved by, let's say, basic salary for healthy community. But they want to put a label. We want to put. It's easy to play the blame.
The victim or blame other ones. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Has there ever been a time when there hasn't been someone as the enemy that you have to protect yourself from in history? Like if there was a system, yeah, there's like always something that people are scared of, and I don't know if it's cyclical or just perception and it's changed.
Mm.
We just don't see what our parents or our grandparents saw. And now we're just, you know, it could be bloody communists, it could be Muslim, it could be whoever. I don't know if there's any part of time when a country hasn't tried to protect itself.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sometimes many persons say, where are you from? And I say, my family, they are refugees. But
Yeah.
now I am living here near Ramallah. I born in Jerusalem. And I am going to Syria to study for 6 years.
Yeah. It's the whole. It's the amalgamation of the whole thing.
When you say refugees, this is political.
Yeah. Okay. So it's political context.
To retain my home.
Hmm.
My grandmother, my grandfather, or father. I am for my sons, or you know.
Mm.
And you can, another things, you can understand or know this is person, this is the language, this is from Jericho, this is from Gaza.
Mm.
You can, some, this is, he is from Hebron. I know some words, he's from Hebron.
Hmm.
You can
Definitely.
know the person from his
Accent and dialect. Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier. Language is identity. And when I speak in Arabic, I'm a totally different person when I speak in English. And therefore, I try to translate between both of them. And it becomes very alienating to an extent. But I feel like it's also liberating to speak in a different context or code of references. Yeah,
I'm asking too much, but
it's okay.
it's a real, honest to God question. When you give your introduction, I got the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that when you talked about diaspora, there you had a certain definition. And the definition, I got the sense from what you were saying, does not apply to the Palestinian displaced.
Hmm.
Am I right? Or can you?
You can't. Well, I said many things, but so Edward Said says it's exile, it's not diaspora. Rushdie says diaspora does not apply to the Palestinian for so many reasons. One, the Palestinian has managed to re-territorialize his homeland in different other spaces, imaginary homelands, right? So he's managed or she's managed to establish an imaginary homeland elsewhere. That's one. Two, a redemption of the diaspora is the return, the physical return to the promised land, and this is not accessible at the minute for the Palestinian, and therefore the concept of diaspora does not apply to the Palestinian community elsewhere. But also, he talks about the fact that exile cannot be tempered with the same network of people in the diaspora, and that's another difference. If I don't know if that answers your question. The image of the book was at the beginning it was a suitcase, so you're no longer the traveler but the suitcase, and then the metaphor was too controversial for the publisher, and I was left with two other options. When you publish with a big publisher like Paragraph Macmillan, you don't have much of a say, to be honest. And I was left with like this silhouette of a man standing somewhere, and I thought it was just too pathetically utopian, whatever you want to call it. And I thought I'll go back to the beginning of the key, which is symbolic of the return. Yeah. You don't like it?
I'm trying to understand it in matters of the generations that you were
Yeah.
for a second.
Yeah.
The third for you was the masala fish, right?
The second and third,
The second and third.
they're the masala fish. The first is the Windrush Generation. So it stops around the 1960s, the late 1960s, mid 1970s. And then it kind of detours to what I call the masala fish generation. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.